The doorbell rang, and Harold Winters felt his heart stop. Through the frosted glass of his mansion's entryway, he could make out two silhouettes, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other petite with long hair cascading down her shoulders. He knew without seeing her face that the woman was Elizabeth, his daughter, whom he hadn't laid eyes on since she was 7 years old. His trembling hand reached for the doorknob, 20 years of regret weighing on his shoulders. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more emotional family dramas that touch the heart. Harold had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but nothing prepared him for the reality of seeing Elizabeth's face, her mother's eyes staring back at him, filled with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. The young man beside her stood protectively close, his hand on the small of her back. Harold's gaze dropped to the envelope clutched in Elizabeth's hand, and he knew this wasn't just a reunion. This was a reckoning. The mansion felt too large and too empty as Harold led them through the marble foyer into the living room. 20 years ago, he had chosen his career over his family, believing he could buy their happiness with the fortune he was building. By the time he realized his mistake, Catherine had taken Elizabeth and disappeared from his life. His wealth had grown exponentially since then, but the emptiness in his heart had grown even faster. "Would you like something to drink?" Harold asked, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He gestured toward the bar cart in the corner, stocked with bottles worth more than most people's monthly salaries. "No, thank you," Elizabeth replied, her voice soft but firm. "We won't be staying long." The young man, Elizabeth had introduced him as Michael, her husband of 2 years, nodded in agreement, his eyes taking in the opulent surroundings with barely concealed judgment. "I understand," Harold said, though he didn't. He wanted to tell her how he'd searched for her, how private investigators had come back empty-handed, how he'd eventually respected Catherine's wish for him to stay away. But the words caught in his throat. Elizabeth placed the envelope on the glass coffee table between them. "Mom died 3 months ago," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Cancer." Harold felt the floor shift beneath him. Catherine, gone? He'd always imagined there would be time to make amends, to explain, to apologize. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "She left me a letter," Elizabeth continued. "And your address. She said it was time for me to decide for myself whether I wanted to know you." Michael squeezed her hand supportively as she pushed the envelope toward Harold. Inside was a photograph, Elizabeth at her college graduation, Catherine beaming beside her. On the back, in Catherine's elegant handwriting, "He should know who she became without him." The words cut through Harold like a knife. He looked up at his daughter, this accomplished, beautiful stranger, and saw 20 years of birthdays, school plays, heartbreaks, and triumphs that he had missed. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Elizabeth's eyes met his, unflinching. "Because I'm pregnant. And I need to know if the man who walked away from his child deserves to know his grandchild." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and the weight of the past. Harold felt tears forming in his eyes for the first time in decades. "I didn't walk away," he said finally. "I was drowning in work, building what I thought would be a legacy for you. By the time I came up for air, you were both gone." Michael leaned forward. "With all due respect, sir, there's a difference between being physically absent and being emotionally absent. Elizabeth's mother made it clear in her diaries that you chose your ambition over your family long before they left." Harold couldn't deny it. The truth was written in the lines of his empty mansion, in the coldness of his bank accounts, in the loneliness of his existence. "You're right," he admitted. "I made the wrong choice. Every day since has been a punishment for that mistake." Elizabeth studied him, searching for sincerity in his weathered face. "I didn't come here for an apology," she said. "I came because I needed to see for myself what kind of man you are now. The baby is due in 5 months, and I don't want my child growing up with the same hole in their life that I had." Harold felt a flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. "What can I do?" he asked simply. "You can start by telling me who you are," Elizabeth replied. "Not what you own or what you've built. Who you are." And so Harold began to talk. He told her about his childhood in poverty, about the fear that had driven him to prioritize financial security above all else. He spoke of the regret that had colored every success, the emptiness of achievements that couldn't be shared. He showed her photographs he'd kept of her as a child, birthday cards he'd written but never sent, a trust fund he'd established in her name that she'd never known about. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the initial tension began to thaw. Michael shared stories of how he and Elizabeth had met in medical school, their dreams of opening a clinic in an underserved community. Harold listened, hungry for every detail of his daughter's life. "We should go," Elizabeth said eventually, checking her watch. "We have a long drive back." Harold walked them to the door, his heart heavy with the thought of them leaving. At the threshold, he gathered his courage. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he said. "But would you consider, would it be possible for us to meet again?" Elizabeth hesitated, her hand on the doorframe. "I don't know," she said honestly. "This is a lot to process." Harold nodded, accepting her uncertainty as the consequence of his choices. "I understand. But if you ever need anything, anything at all, I'm here." As they turned to leave, Elizabeth paused. "There is one thing," she said. "The clinic we want to open, we're having trouble securing funding." Harold felt a surge of purpose. "I can help with that," he said quickly, then caught himself. "But only if you'll let me. No strings attached." Michael and Elizabeth exchanged a look, years of communication passing between them in seconds. "We'll think about it," Elizabeth said finally. "Maybe we could discuss it over dinner next week?" Harold felt his heart swell with a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "I'd like that very much." After they left, Harold stood in the doorway of his mansion, watching their car disappear down the long driveway. For the first time in 20 years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. He had been given a second chance, not to rewrite the past, but perhaps to be part of the future. The weeks that followed brought cautious steps toward reconciliation. Dinner became a weekly tradition, with Harold learning to listen more than he spoke. He discovered that Elizabeth had inherited his head for business but her mother's compassion. Michael, initially wary, began to warm to him as Harold demonstrated his commitment to making amends through actions rather than words or money. When Elizabeth invited Harold to accompany them to an ultrasound appointment, he wept at the sight of his grandchild's heartbeat flickering on the screen. "It's a girl," the technician announced, and Harold felt the circle of life continuing despite his mistakes. The clinic became their shared project. Harold provided the funding but insisted that Elizabeth and Michael maintain complete control. He found purpose in using his business acumen to help their vision become reality, offering advice when asked but learning to step back when not needed. As Elizabeth's pregnancy progressed, Harold helped them convert a room in their modest home into a nursery. While painting the walls a soft yellow, Elizabeth asked the question that had been hanging between them for months. "Did you ever regret it? Choosing work over us?" Harold set down his paintbrush, giving her question the consideration it deserved. "Every day," he said simply. "But regret is useless without change. I can't undo the past, but I can try to be better now." Elizabeth nodded, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Mom forgave you, you know. In her letter, she said she understood why you made the choices you did. She just couldn't live with them." Harold felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not completely, but enough to stand a little straighter. "Your mother was always wiser than me." The day Elizabeth went into labor, Harold paced the hospital waiting room, more nervous than he'd ever been closing multi-million-dollar deals. Michael kept him updated, his earlier reservations forgotten in the shared anxiety of the moment. When he was finally allowed into the room, Harold approached the bed where Elizabeth cradled a tiny bundle. She looked up at him, exhausted but radiant. "Dad," she said, the words still new and fragile between them, "meet your granddaughter, Catherine." Harold's hands trembled as Elizabeth placed the infant in his arms. Looking down at Catherine's tiny face, he made a silent promise to be present for every moment he could, to value time over money, love over achievement. "She's perfect," he whispered. In the months that followed, Harold surprised everyone, including himself, by selling his mansion and moving to a comfortable but modest home near Elizabeth and Michael. The proceeds from the sale went into a foundation dedicated to supporting family health initiatives, with the clinic as its flagship project. On Catherine's first birthday, as they gathered in the backyard of Elizabeth and Michael's home, Harold watched his daughter laughing with her husband, their child toddling between them. He thought about the 20 years he had lost and the years he had gained. He thought about second chances and the courage it takes to offer forgiveness. Elizabeth caught his eye across the yard and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. In that moment, Harold knew that while wealth could build empires, only love could build a legacy worth having. As the sun set on the celebration, Harold sat on the porch swing with little Catherine asleep in his arms. "We're going to get it right this time," he whispered to her. "I promise." And in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the family he had almost lost forever, Harold Winters finally understood that the richest man in the world is not the one with the most possessions, but the one who needs the least to be happy. The clinic opened its doors 6 months later, serving a community that had long been without adequate health care. On the wall of the entrance hung a simple plaque, "The Catherine Winters Memorial Clinic, because everyone deserves a second chance." Harold volunteered there 3 days a week, using his business connections to ensure the clinic had everything it needed. The other days, he spent with Catherine, reading her stories and building the relationship with his granddaughter that he had failed to build with his daughter. One evening, as they sat on Elizabeth and Michael's porch after putting Catherine to bed, Elizabeth handed Harold a small box. "What's this?" he asked, surprised. "Open it," she urged. Inside was a key and a handwritten note, "For Dad's office at the clinic." Harold looked up, confused. "I already have an office." Elizabeth smiled. "Not like this one. We've expanded the pediatric wing, and we need someone to run the new children's reading program. Someone who's good with kids and has time on his hands." Harold felt tears prick his eyes. "Are you sure?" "Catherine adores your stories," Michael said, joining them. "And we've seen how you are with the children at the clinic. They respond to you." For a man who had spent his life chasing wealth and status, the simple acknowledgement of his worth beyond his money was the greatest gift Harold could imagine. As the years passed, Harold watched Catherine grow, celebrated the birth of a grandson, and witnessed the clinic expand to serve thousands. The hole in his heart, carved by 20 years of absence, gradually filled with new memories, new connections, new purpose. On his 80th birthday, surrounded by family in the home he had once thought too small to visit, Harold received a leather-bound album from Elizabeth. Inside were photographs spanning the years since their reunion, Catherine's first steps, holidays, ordinary moments made extraordinary by the simple fact of being together. On the final page was a recent family portrait with a handwritten message: "Some journeys take longer than others, but what matters is that we find our way home. Thank you for finding your way back to us, Dad. Love, Elizabeth." Harold closed the album, his heart full. The fortune he had spent his youth building had given him comfort in his old age, but it was the fortune of family, hard-won and nearly lost, that had given him peace. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, Harold reflected on the man he had been and the man he had become. He thought about the price of ambition and the value of redemption. Most of all, he thought about the daughter who had found the courage to give her father a second chance, and in doing so, had given him the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to know what truly matters before it was too late. In the end, Harold Winters discovered that it's never too late to rewrite your legacy, not with money or power, but with love, presence, and the humble recognition that sometimes, the most precious things in life are the ones that can't be bought. If this story touched your heart, Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about family, forgiveness, and finding what truly matters in life. Remember, it's never too late for a second chance. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to open the door when opportunity knocks.